Howdy, friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
Guess I'll go and look after Johnny.
Miss Lowe, you're a liar. And an almighty poor liar.
I don't understand you.
These horses haven't been shod in a couple of months. It's a cinch that axe hasn't had an edge on it in 2 months. And your tea can, a 5-pound tea can in your house is empty. Your husband's been gone a long time.
Now, look here, Mr. Lane. I don't think you have any right
I'm
to
not
talk to me.
talking about rights. I'm talking about lies. Why'd you lie to me, Mrs. Lowe? Were you afraid that maybe you wouldn't be safe here with me, with your husband away? Is that it?
That's partly it.
Women always figure every man comes along wants them.
That was John Wayne confronting Geraldine Page in the 1953 classic Hondo, which we'll be discussing on this episode of How the West Was Cast. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernov, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now, before we continue, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Western Podcast. That's at, as in the at symbol, Western Podcast, all one word. Tell us about your favorite John Wayne Western, and you just might hear us discuss it on a future episode. Also, if you enjoy our show and want to help support it, the best way you can do that is by subscribing to it on whatever platform you use. Okay then, Andrew, why don't you set the scene and give us some backstory on Hondo?
Hondo stars John Wayne as Hondo Lane, an Army dispatch rider who befriends a woman and her young son who are living on a remote ranch in Arizona in 1870. The woman, Angie Lowe, tells Hondo her husband is away. Hondo warns her of an Apache uprising. She replies that her family has always lived in peace with the Apache and refuses to leave. Hondo quickly warms to wife and son and is reluctant to leave them. Thus are planted the seeds of the movie's drama. Hondo was based on a short story called The Gift of Cochise by Louis L'Amour. John Wayne's fledgling production company, Wayne Fellows, acquired the movie rights and set James Edward Grant to work on the adaptation. Production took place largely on location in Camargo, Mexico in the summer of 1953 under the direction of John Farrow, an intelligent craftsman who had worked steadily across many genres since the 1930s and had earned a Best Director nomination for the 1942 war film Wake Island. Wayne's Hondo co-stars included stage actress Geraldine Page as Angie Lowe, Lee Aker as Angie's son Johnny, Ward Bond as Hondo's friend Buffalo Baker, and Australian character actor Michael Pate as the Apache chief Vittorio. Hondo is very much a Western of its time. The movie's setup, a buckskin-clad gunman comes upon a remote ranch that includes a handsome blonde wife and a young boy, recalls an earlier 53 release, Shane. Hondo is also one of many Westerns released in the 1950s that took a more sympathetic view of Indian peoples and customs, and finds Wayne in the familiar character of the man who knows Indians. It's a character almost every leading man of the decade played at some point, and one that Wayne had played before in Fort Apache. It's also one he'd play again, in a much darker inflection, 3 years later in The Searchers. Finally, Hondo was filmed in the briefly fashionable 3D format, which Hollywood hoped would stem a post-war decline in moviegoing. Of its time, Hondo may be, but it's certainly better than most other Man Who Knows Indians westerns, and is unquestionably the best 3D western of the 1950s. When Hondo opened in November of 1953, critics and audiences responded enthusiastically. Variety called the film an exciting offbeat western that, like Shane, gives the western an aura of maturity. Made for $1.32 million, it returned worldwide rentals of $5.9 million, making it one of the highest-grossing films of the year. The film was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, Best Writing and Best Supporting Actress. Hondo even spawned a short-lived television series that ran for 17 episodes on ABC in late 1967. Wayne's affection for Hondo is evident in the many references to it in his later work, especially in the 1970s. his relationship with the Indian chief White Buffalo in Chisholm, a wanted poster for an outlaw named Hondo Lane in Rio Bravo, his character's dog in Big Jake, and characters named Lane and Mrs. Lowe in The Train Robbers. Many listeners to this podcast will probably be surprised, though, to learn that this beloved, successful film nearly disappeared in the decades after its release. An agreement with distributor Warner Brothers saw the rights to the film revert back to Wayne, who kept it under lock and key, along with other Wayne Fellows productions like Island in the Sky and The High and the Mighty. Aside from the occasional showing on television, Hondo was basically unseen until 1992, when it was restored and released to home video. This is why Hondo receives next to no attention in Wayne biographies and writing about the Western from before the 1990s. In recent years, the film has accrued the reputation as one of the Duke's best. In his 2014 biography of the actor, Scott Eyman calls Hondo probably the best movie Wayne ever made that wasn't directed by John Ford or Howard Hawks. It's hard to disagree. While John Ford did show up on the set of Hondo to check in on Wayne and even direct a few scenes, as he'd do again on Wayne's production of The Alamo in 1960, Hondo marks an important step towards independence by the actor John Wayne.
So for this episode, we've each selected 5 key elements of Hondo that we want to highlight and discuss. Now, these can be anything from a specific performance to a favorite scene to a line of dialogue or a theme that we think is especially noteworthy. So, Andrew, what's your number 5?
My number 5 is Wayne Fellows Productions, the independent production company founded by John Wayne and producer Robert Fellows in 1952. Independent movie making has always been a part of the film business. Most of the major Hollywood studios of the industry's golden age were founded by what were initially independent producers, people like Carl Laemmle and Samuel Goldwyn. In the teens, these men and others fled the East Coast, and Thomas Edison's monopolistic business practices, to make movies in Los Angeles. A certain amount of filmmaking has always taken place outside of, on the margins of, or adjacent to the mainstream industry. The ability of actors to move into production roles increased dramatically following a 1944 Supreme Court decision that brought an end to the 7-year option contracts most studios employed. Actors were no longer indentured servants to their home studios and were able to exercise greater control over their careers. For example, in 1947, Humphrey Bogart left Warner Brothers, his cinematic home for 20 years, and founded his own independent production company that distributed through Columbia. 6 years later, James Stewart made Hollywood business history when he appeared in the Western Winchester 73 for a percentage of the film's profits rather than a straight salary. He became a millionaire almost overnight. Wayne began working as a producer on some of his own films at Republic Pictures in the 1940s, but grew frustrated with Republic's constant delays on an informal agreement to let Wayne produce and direct his dream project, The Alamo. Wayne was a huge box office draw in the early 1950s, but being on the shady side of 40 years old and with a receding hairline, he knew his days as a romantic leading man were numbered. Wayne Fellows Productions would give the actor greater control over his career. He could tailor roles to his strengths, work more as a producer, and, he hoped, begin to direct. After 2 successful movies, Wayne Fellows signed an 8-picture distribution agreement with Warner Brothers that would see Wayne Fellows retain ownership of any movie that made enough money. Hondo was the second film made under this agreement, and it exemplifies the Wayne Fellows approach to filmmaking. Popular dramatic material, tightly scripted, that could be filmed on a reasonable budget, helmed by efficient veterans like Farrow, William A. Wellman, and later Andy McLaughlin and Burt Kennedy, featuring Wayne or another leading man, and supported by a capable cast of character actors, including many from the Ford-Wayne stock company. It was a successful formula, and one that Wayne Fellows, later renamed Batjack Productions, would follow until the end of the Duke's career.
I'm really fascinated by Batjack Productions and what was going on behind the scenes there. Every time I read a Wayne biography, I really love to hear about the inner workings of that company and how it controlled the way the audience saw Wayne and the films that he was making at the time. I guess the only comparable one that you can compare it to, that type of actor-owned production company, would be Malpaso, Eastwood's company, which is formed for a lot of the same reasons. In order to, maintain a steady hand on how his films are made and to get the projects off the ground that he wanted to. There's a lot of similarities between Batjack, I think, and Malpaso. Anytime as a kid when I would see that Malpaso logo, I always kind of perked up because you knew you were going to see something very consistent. Those films all have a through line, even though he's playing different characters in each of them. The quality was always really strong. He made them all on budget, which was another reason why I think he could control those films. So it's one of the more successful versions of that actor-owned production company.
Yeah. I mean, there was a real attempt to run it as a kind of studio in miniature. So as much as they were going to be contracting out different directors, for example, they went back to William A. Wellman repeatedly, precisely because he was so reliable. They had their own in-house cameramen. One of them was William Clothier, who became one of the greatest cinematographers towards the end of the 20th century. Also in-house people to do art. They even tried to have performers under contract. So James Arness was under contract to Batjack initially and stars in a couple of films, not only Hondo, but also big Jim McClane. The other important thing that Wayne did, and I think this speaks to the consistency as well as the attempt to make sure that these came in under budget, was that he tried to learn from the mistakes of others, and in particular from John Ford and Howard Hawks, both of whom had their own production companies earlier. So that would be Ford's Argosy Productions and Howard Hawks' very short-lived Winchester Pictures, which were much more ambitious in their attempts to make large-scale films, and it just wasn't sustainable in the way that Batjack was.
I often wish that his sons, Wayne's sons, had continued making Batjack films after their father's death. I know they kept the company going to maintain those movies and to really care for them and restore them as they did with Hondo. But it would have been great to see them bring in some of Wayne's co-stars and make it like in my dream would be, it became the studio or production company for those mature action heroes who could find a production company who understood them and could package them in the way that they had previously packaged Wayne. That would have been so exciting to see.
I agree. I mean, certainly some of the Batjack company were able to continue making similar films. So Andy McLaughlin would be the best example, who continues to make, say, The Wild Geese. But yes, you could imagine a scenario where he has an extra decade making the types of films that appeal to Wayne's audience. I think the belief was that Wayne was key to the appeal of these sorts of films. And there's some evidence of that. We can look back in the 1970s, for example, and you can see that some of the Westerns that McLaughlin made without Wayne, The Last Hard Man, or other Westerns like Something Big with Dean Martin, just don't have the same appeal as The Duke. So I think Wayne's heirs recognized that the key, at least to them, they believed, was Wayne himself. I think there's also, and maybe you can tell me what you think about this, something of a stigma around some Batjack productions. I think for a long time, and maybe this is changing, or maybe it isn't, the Batjack films were seen as lesser efforts to the films that Wayne would make at other studios. So the 70s, I think, is a real case in point. Let's say the late 60s and 70s. So the Batjack films are, Chisholm, Big Jake, Cahill, whereas the non-Batjack films are True Grit, The Cowboys, and The Shootist. So there's a kind of quantitative and qualitative difference between those films in terms of budgets, but also in terms of, prestige, I suppose, in some ways. But I'm inclined to see those Batjack films as being equally interesting, maybe because they were neglected, but I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
I totally agree with you. I wasn't so aware of that discrepancy that people felt, that the non-Batjacks had this different prestige to them almost. It makes sense when you describe those films, the Cowboys and whatnot and True Grit. They do stand alone in a way as these classics of their time. But I guess I wasn't aware that the Batjack films weren't taken quite as seriously, because I was taking them plenty seriously. And it's wonderful to have the two to choose from, to have the individual movies made by auteurs and then the Batjack films, which were their own little thing. I mean, Eastwood did the same thing. Sometimes he would do Malpaso projects, and then occasionally there would be one that wasn't. That was more of a studio project. And I love that back and forth, that you can choose those when you want to. Now, John Wayne named Batjack after a fictitious trading company that was mentioned in a film that he made called Wake of the Red Witch. Well, we're about to listen to a short clip from that movie, so let's hear the very first mention of the word Batjack for ourselves. Check it out.
Know who owns this ship?
Batjack Limited.
Know what Batjack is?
Mayor in Sydney.
Sit down. Know anything about him?
Only that he seems to own most of this part of the world.
I've sailed this ship for him a long time, and he has great confidence in his captain.
All right, Matt, what is your number 5?
My number 5 is Sam the Dog. Now, every great Western hero deserves a loyal sidekick. It's practically a rule of the genre, and John Wayne had some of the best in movie history. But few, to my mind, are as memorable as Sam the Dog. Portrayed by a canine actor named Pal, who's best known for playing Lassie in a series of classic family films, Sam is Hondo's ever-present companion, a mangy, four-legged ally who roams the range with him, fending off threats and loneliness in equal measure. Moreover, Sam represents Hondo's fierce independence and his elemental connection to the natural world. The two of them share much in common, and watching the way that they mirror each other is one of the great pleasures Hondo offers. Hondo clearly admires Sam's self-reliance, so much so that he asks Angie Lo not to feed the dog, fearing that he'll become dependent on accepting help from others. He doesn't need anyone, Hondo tells her proudly. I want him to stay that way. It's a good way. That last line, "it's a good way," is one of the reoccurring themes of Hondo, and of Wayne's persona more broadly. Variations of it turn up again and again in other Wayne films, as well as in quotes that the actor gave during interviews, so it's interesting to note that it was first introduced in response to Sam the Dog. In some ways, Sam was quite a trendsetter. Heroic canines became a familiar sight in the genre after Hondo. As Andrew mentioned in his intro, Big Jake pairs Wayne with a mutt named simply Dog, who functions as a reliable member of his posse. Years later, in Dances with Wolves, we meet Two Socks, who bonds with Kevin Costner on the South Dakota prairie. Other examples include Chuck Norris's Pet Wolf in Lone Wolf McQuade, and Ethan Hawke's Border Collie in the recent Western In a Valley of Violence. Now, speaking as someone who, in general, prefers the company of dogs to people, it pains me to confess that as much as I love the concept of Sam the Dog, I'm a little less fond of the performance that Pal gives in the film. No offense, but he's just the wrong breed for the role. The producers did what they could to dirty him up a bit, even going so far as to paint a Frankenstein-like scar on his forehead, but he just never seems vicious enough to pull it off. He's far too small and shaggy and, well, cute for the role. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of Pal's acting ability. In fact, when Variety asked me to write an article ranking the 20 greatest dogs in movie history, I put Pal at number 2, just a whisker behind the immortal Benji, who claimed the top spot. For my money, the depiction of Sam in Louis L'Amour's novelization of Hondo feels much more authentic. The author describes him as a big, ugly brute and a rough-looking mongrel, neither of which come to mind when I think of Pal. Overall, though, Sam is everything a Western hero could want in a sidekick. He's low maintenance, loyal to a fault, and ready to lay down his life in service to his master. What more could anyone ask for?
Yes, good old Lassie, who, as you may know, was actually kidnapped by the Camargo locals at one point during the production and ransomed for what I understand was a fairly modest sum. You know, one thing I find really interesting about the role of the dog in this film is how important Sam is. He is a sidekick in the sense that we would expect a human character, particularly in the way that his death is a death that needs to be avenged, which is usually reserved for a human character in Westerns. And that death, of course, though, is also symbolic of Hondo's transformation. So it's really rare, not only for a Western, but just for a film in general, for a canine character to have such a central, not only narrative, but also symbolic function.
If you like Sam the dog, I really recommend reading the Louis L'Amour novel, because he takes the script and he fleshes out everybody in it, including Sam. We learn all these little details that we don't get in the film. For instance, we learn that Hondo and Sam have been together for 11 years, at least according to the book. And we also discovered that at one point, Hondo was almost forced to eat Sam. They were, apparently they were caught in a snowstorm and spent 3 days without food. So Hondo confesses at one point to Angie, he says, quote, "Suddenly I started taking a looking at Sam." In the end, though, he found a snowbound moose, so they ate that instead. He said he didn't look forward to eating Sam because he thought he would probably taste tougher than a moccasin. It's a great book, really.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that in the intro, that this is actually an interesting case of adaptation where a short story becomes a film, but then the author of the short story takes the script to the film and then turns it into a very successful novel. I agree with you about, Lassie not really fitting the part. Even Lassie in what I guess is the canine equivalent of blackface,
right,
just doesn't have the kind of presence for a dog. There are some shots of him growling as he interacts with the boy, but even they are not particularly convincing. He's just such a graceful and fluffy looking animal that there isn't any kind of menace or really much of a sense that he could survive independently, as John Wayne suggests he could.
It would have been nice to see a big, ugly, like a dog that only Hondo could love, like a scary looking monster dog almost, who's kind of broken down but really tough. I wanted, that's the version that I picture in the novel. When you mentioned Sam's death, it's interesting too the way that death is played out. There's not a lot of remorse from Hondo. He sort of cuts that part of himself off.
Yeah.
In the novel, we see the death more clearly. Angie runs out after Sam has been stabbed with a spear, and she cradles him as he's dying. We don't get this in the movie, but she holds him, and she's been scared of him the entire time, and he gently licks her hand, and she starts calling him good boy, and he dies with human comfort.
Yeah.
So in his final few moments, he does achieve that dependence on somebody else and offers a signal to that person that there's a caring there. So it's really powerful.
The way it's filmed, we're alerted to a sound outside, and we cut to a shot of Silva, who's the sort of Apache evil second in command, played by Rodolfo Acosta. And the camera tilts down along his spear, and we just very briefly see that he's impaled Sam, but it almost cuts short. The film doesn't linger on it, and there could be a variety of reasons for that. But it does seem a little bit too abrupt to me in the finished film.
What can I feed your dog?
Nothing, thanks. He makes out by himself and outrun any rabbit in the territory.
Oh, it's no trouble at all.
If you don't mind, ma'am, I'd rather you didn't feed him.
Oh, I see. You don't want him to get in the habit of taking food from anyone else. Well, you can hand it to him.
No, ma'am, I don't feed him either. Sam's independent. He doesn't need anybody. I want him to stay that way. It's a good way.
Well, everyone needs someone.
Yes, ma'am, most everyone. Too bad, isn't it?
Okay, Andrew, and what is your number 4?
My number 4 is James Edward Grant's script. Grant was not only John Wayne's favorite screenwriter, he was one of his closest friends. Starting out as a crime reporter in Chicago, Grant first came to Hollywood in 1935 to adapt his best-selling novel, Whipsaw. He went on to write or contribute to scripts for more than 50 films, sometimes credited, often not. He collaborated with Wayne on 12 pictures, starting with Angel and the Bad Man in 1947, which Grant also directed, and including Big Jim McLean, The Alamo, and the fan favorite McClintock. Grant excelled at writing the honest, casual dialogue that Wayne preferred, and had a knack for punctuating scenes with an especially effective line or exchange. Sometimes these are humorous. One of my favorite moments in Hondo is when Hondo is about to introduce Buffalo Baker to Angie and realizes he doesn't know Buffalo's last name. "Of course I got a last name. What do you think I am?" says Buffalo. Hondo replies, "I know what you are, but there's a lady present." Often, however, these kinds of lines are dramatic and moving. Hondo's best written scene is, for my money, when Hondo departs the Low homestead for the first time. Grant masterfully intertwines two separate strands of conversation into one. One strand is superficial, as Angie remarks about horses and the weather. The other, about Hondo's former life among the Apaches with a now-deceased Indian wife, emerges at intervals in fleeting sentences couched between the mundanities. "You loved her?" Angie asks furtively. "I don't know," Hondo replies. "I needed her." This delicate dance of dialogue perfectly reflects the play of attraction and withdrawal between Hondo and Angie in the movie's first act.
Grant's script really should be taught in screenwriting classes. It's that good. His language is so clean and clear. There's no waste in this script whatsoever. It's, as you said, simultaneously poetic and austere, which is a really tricky combo to pull off. I can tell you from personal experience that just does not happen. I've never seen a copy of the script itself, which I'm really curious to, because I'd love to see how he handles writing the descriptive passages, not just the dialogue. I want to see if he writes those descriptive elements and the action scenes with the same level of control and brevity that he uses with the dialogue that really makes things mean so much more. It's one of the goals as a screenwriter, to my mind, is always to leave as little ink on the page as possible. That was always a sign with my writing partner and I, David, when we knew that we had a good scene, was when it had almost a white page, because the reader then reads it that much quicker and the story almost just downloads into their head, where they don't have to dicker around with the words that we're using. And I'm going to assume that Grant probably writes with that same type of clarity. Because the dialogue in the film is just masterful that way.
I haven't seen the script either. I know that his collection of personal materials is at the University of Texas at Austin, I believe. So maybe a listener out there can go track it down and let us know. Like you, I appreciate the economy of the script. Its kind of leanness. And again, the dialogue is on point. I wonder if, and I'll say more about this later in this episode, but I wonder if the restrictions that came with filming in 3D, in particular the short running time, might have actually benefited Grant in this instance, because many of his screenplays, including those for Wayne, are considerably longer. If you think about The Alamo or McClintock, those are much more expository films, much more leisurely paced in many ways. And I've read some criticism that sort of knocks Grant for being a little bit too on the nose when it came to things like exposition. So it could be a case that there were certain restrictions in place that forced him to rein in some bad habits and allowed him to shine. But having not ever seen one of his scripts, I don't know if they are as clean as you'd imagine, or maybe this is just something that transitioned over the course of his career as we got into the 1960s and the pictures he was writing for Wayne became bigger.
I'm also hard-pressed to think of another actor-writer combo like we get with Wayne and Grant so often. You hear tons of actor-director combos and director-writer collaborations, but actors and writers who follow each other's career, that seems really unusual today. So it's notable that these two men really shared a single voice.
Yeah. That's in a roundabout way something that Wayne would often bring up in his recollections about Grant, who died in the 60s, I believe, from lung cancer. So Grant didn't even live as long as Wayne. But Wayne would always remark about what a great writer Grant was, how because he came out of short stories, he had a real sense of economy. Of course, he had a knack for a particular type of dialogue. But what Wayne would comment on ultimately was the relationship that they were able to develop. And Wayne was acutely aware that one of the people that actors have the least contact with is the writer. That's not a relationship that's usually encouraged. But in this case, it was a productive working relationship as well as a rewarding friendship.
I had producers literally tell me on the set of movies that I've made not to talk to the actors because they will hit you up for changes to their scenes and their dialogue. I was warned away. Do not approach Armand Asante or he will have you rewrite his entire scene. So, yes, it's an interesting relationship between the writer and then the actor. It doesn't always work out as wonderfully as it did for Wayne and Grant.
The nominations for the best story and screenplay written directly for the screen are the defiant ones. Story and screenplay by Nathan E. Douglas and Harold Jacob Smith.
The Goddess, story and screenplay by Patty Chayefsky.
Houseboat, story and screenplay by Melville Shelverson and Jack Roth.
The Sheepman, story by James Edward Grant, screenplay by William Bowers and James Edward Grant.
The winner is the defiant one, Nathan Douglas.
Okay, Matt, what is your number 4?
My number 4 is the theme music to Hondo. Although you don't always see it listed in articles ranking the top Western film music of all time, the theme to Hondo is nevertheless one of my personal favorites. What I appreciate most about this particular theme is that it's not action music. It's also not romantic music or a nostalgic theme designed to transport listeners back to the Old West. No. What it is a heroic theme, and a powerful one at that. With its bold opening fanfare and its crashing cymbals, the theme to Hondo is a triumphant call to arms. In some ways, it reminds me of Hondo Lane himself. Robust, unpretentious, and inspiring. There's a storybook quality to the string section that kicks in partway through the theme that feels perfectly in keeping with the fable-like tale we're about to watch. Throughout the film, we're treated to variations on the opening theme, each one tweaked just slightly to better capture the mood of the particular scene it's used in. In fact, considering how often we hear it in the movie, it's somewhat surprising then that it never gets old or feels repetitive or recycled. From start to finish, it remains fresh and exciting, which makes it all the more shocking that there has never been an official soundtrack release for Hondo. I simply don't know how that's possible, but it's true. The film's score is credited to Oscar-winning composer Hugo Friedhofer and Oscar nominee Emil Newman. Both men have a staggering list of film credits to their names, including many classic westerns. However, when it comes to who actually wrote the theme to Hondo, things get a little murky. The truth is, crediting on films from this period is not an exact science, and just because someone's name is listed on screen, well, you can't always take that at face value. To me, the theme to Hondo sounds very much like the work of Friedhofer. There are echoes here of his brilliant scores to Broken Arrow and Veracruz, which makes me think that it's primarily his doing. Now, while prepping this episode, I learned that the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers has no record of Emil Newman actually working as a composer on Hondo. Likewise, the late film historian Clifford McCarty, whose book Film Composers in America is the essential guide on the subject, attributes Hondo's score solely to Friedhofer. Yet, regardless of who wrote what, one thing is undeniable. The theme to Hondo is a timeless piece of music that beautifully captures the spirit of one of John Wayne's greatest characters.
I confess that when you first told me that you were going to talk about the theme, I couldn't bring the theme to mind for whatever reason. Now, having watched the film a couple more times, with this in mind, I can't get it out of my head, which is a sign of a good theme. I think it maybe eludes me because it lacks the lyrics of a lot of the films of the 1950s, like High Noon or The Searchers or so on. I'm inclined to agree with you that Friedhofer probably did this. It does sound a lot like Broken Arrow and Veracruz. And interestingly, Friedhofer ended up scoring at least a couple of other Westerns in the kind of the pro-Indian cycle. He also did the score for White Feather, which Delmer Daves, who directed Broken Arrow, wrote, and then also a late entry, Geronimo, in 1962. So it seems that he almost became the go-to guy for the score for this particular type of Western, which is interesting.
I know what you mean about not being able to recall it sometimes. Although I love this theme, I don't necessarily hear it all the time in my head, or I can't call it up the way I can some other ones. But when I'm watching the film, when I put it on and that first starts, it just works so perfectly. It almost just works better with the movie than it does as a standalone. You need those opening images of him galloping directly towards the camera as we hear the crescendo of that opening theme. It's such a perfect combination of music and image. As far as the crediting is concerned, there's another wrinkle that I didn't mention, which is that the TV show Laramie, which ran from 1959 to 1963, the theme to that TV show is music lifted directly from Hondo. And yet, on Laramie, that theme is credited to Cyril Mockridge, another classic composer who wrote the music to The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and River of No Return. So how he ended up credited on music from Hondo on his TV show is anybody's guess. It's such a weird history behind who actually wrote this music.
I'm going to have to listen to these again to make sure, but yeah, that does make sense. And and Mockridge is also a well-known Western composer. I think he did Liberty Valance. Did you say that? I think he did Liberty Valance as well. So maybe this is just more proof of the point that you began with, where once upon a time, the rules around who got screen credit and who didn't weren't quite as clear as they are today.
What I'd like to do right now is play the opening theme to Hondo. That way we can hear exactly what it is we've been talking about.
My number 3 is Geraldine Page as Mrs. Angie Lowe. Page was a trained method actor who rose to notice on the New York stage in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Her performance in a 1952 production of the Tennessee Williams play Summer and Smoke earned her several awards and a profile in Time magazine titled Edge of Greatness. A method actor from the stage, whose personal eccentricities included not bathing, may seem an unlikely choice to cast opposite John Wayne in a Western set in the Arizona Territory. But cast Page was, and, after some extensive dental work to make her smile screen-ready, She arrived on Hondo's Mexico location prepared to deliver the type of sensitive, perceptive performance that had won her acclaim on the stage. Some commentary on Hondo suggests that Page being out of place in a Western was well suited to the role of Mrs. Lowe, but I think this is mistaken. Angie isn't out of place in the West. She's been on her ranch her entire life. What disrupts Angie's familiar life and routine is the absence of her husband and the arrival of Hondo. Page's performance expertly conveys this tension of being uncomfortable in a familiar setting. I'm in fact always struck by the nuance and restraint of her acting, both for how this defies most conceptions of method acting and how it contrasts with the comparatively demonstrative performances of many of Wayne's other leading ladies, like Maureen O'Hara. Page's subtlety makes her more than a match for Wayne, who is a master of acting with glances and gestures. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about Page's rather infamous line of dialogue, "I am fully aware that I am a homely woman, Mr. Lane." How often do you hear the female romantic lead admit to being homely? And Page isn't homely, of course. She just isn't conventionally beautiful by 1950s Hollywood standards. Purportedly, this line of dialogue was devised on the set after John Ford arrived and pronounced that no one would believe Wayne could be interested in such an ordinary woman. Now, maybe this story is true, yet Page's looks, or supposed lack thereof, were actually part of her persona well before she made Hondo. The 1952 Time magazine profile began, and I quote, "To be a great stage star, an actress need not be beautiful, but she must be able to conjure up and project an image of beauty. This plain young woman has this talent in a remarkable degree." That talent, and as Hondo demonstrated, many others. It's really an ultimate testament to Page's acting that she was able to transcend the limitations of mind that defined acting, both on the stage and on the screen in the 1950s.
Yeah, that homely woman line is just, it's crazy. It's hugely insulting, and it doesn't make any sense. She cuts such a lovely figure in this movie. She's got this unabashedly open and expressive face. She cuts such a beautiful figure on screen. So I guess I know what you're saying about the conventionality of Hollywood beauty and at that time and today. And so maybe there was an issue there, but it's really hard to hear her say that. I just kind of gloss over that moment every time it happens.
It is. And she, has a kind of, I don't know, a bemused expression on her face when she says the line. And it does lead into an exchange where Wayne is in his kind of awkward Wayne romantic mode way, saying that, she isn't a stunning beauty, but she has a different kind of beauty and an inner beauty. So I think the line does ultimately work. But again, what I found so interesting was it wasn't just limited to this one film. There was the idea that she just didn't match up with the conception of beauty at the time, just in generally for an actress.
And it's such a shame, too, because she really is the heart of the movie. If Wayne embodies the spirit of the story, then Page is the emotional center. I cringe whenever I picture another actress taking this role because of the damage it might do to the integrity of the story. The way she modulates her performance, depending on who she's talking to, whether it's Wayne or little Johnny or Vittorio, she's such a different person in each of those instances. The way she plays her scenes with Michael Pate is really interesting. Angie is obviously frightened of him, but there's a lot more going on there between those two characters. I feel like there's this unspoken attraction happening, especially in those scenes where Vittorio demands that she choose an Apache husband. I keep thinking that she wants him to volunteer for the role, like that the two of them would share some kind of connection rather than these other braves he keeps throwing her away. It's an interesting dynamic between those two characters that doesn't get talked about enough, I think.
I agree, and certainly that plays into the similar attraction and repulsion she feels for Hondo, and Hondo being paralleled with Vittorio in many different ways, right down to the deaths of their family. It is a multifaceted performance from the get-go, where she, is overacting in a very kind of plausible way, trying to convince Hondo that her husband is going to be back any moment now, to the much more convincing lie that she tells Vittorio when he dumps Hondo at her feet and says, "Is this your man?" And she says, "Yes." I mean, it's a remarkable performance of transformation and nuance. And as you probably read, Page was given something of a hard time on the set by John Wayne, particularly because of her method acting background. What's interesting to me about at least the interviews I've read with Geraldine Page is how she was a very intelligent woman, and how she had a very clear-eyed perspective, I guess, on Wayne, how she would, like many people, be surprised that he was such a sensible, intelligent person, which seemed to defy his larger persona. This is a recurring feature in interviews with folks who had an opportunity to get to know Wayne. But then also how she found herself succumbing to his charms, where he would, be badgering her and making fun of her just to the breaking point, and then he'd pull back and say, "Oh, you're not mad at all, Duke," and she would melt like a girl, something that she even confessed to. I mean, it clearly wasn't the type of relationship that they were going to replicate anytime soon, and I don't imagine the Duke was all that happy about her Oscar nomination, which seems deserved to me. But for what it is, for this unique pairing in this film, as you said, it's hard to imagine anyone else in that role.
To present the next Oscar, here's a gentleman who has won 3 himself, the lovable Walter Brennan.
Nominees for the best performance by an actress in supporting role are Grace Kelly in Mogambo, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer; Geraldine Page in Hondo, a Wayne Fellows production, Warner Brothers; Marjorie Rambeau in Torch Song, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer; Donna Reed in From Here to Eternity, Columbia; Thelma Ritter in Pickup on South Street, 20th Century Fox. The winner is Donna Reed.
My number 3 is Ward Bond. Now, John Wayne worked with many of the same actors and filmmakers throughout his career, and one of the founding members of that stock company of players was character actor Ward Bond, a gruff, burly, physically intimidating man who approached life in a way not dissimilar from the characters he portrayed. Bond was one of Wayne's oldest and dearest friends. They made a whopping 23 films together, and many of them, like Fort Apache, The Searchers, and The Quiet Man, rank high among Wayne's finest movies. He always reminds me of actors like Forrest Tucker or Edmund O'Brien or Lee J. Cobb. These were big, barrel-chested men whose surly personas hinted at a volcanic anger lurking just beneath the surface. In Hondo, Bond plays Buffalo Baker, a crusty frontier scout who, along with Sam the dog, is one of Hondo's only pals. Their good-natured sparring resembles the raucous rivalry that Bond and Wayne were famous for in real life. Born in Nebraska in 1903, Bond first worked with Wayne on John Ford's sports drama Salute in 1929. After that, he quickly amassed a long list of credits in a short amount of time. By 1935, he was making upwards of 30 movies in a single year. What's impressive about his filmography isn't just the amount of movies he made, but the fact that he was cast in so many bona fide classics like Bringing Up Baby, Gone with the Wind, and The Maltese Falcon. In fact, his list of credits is so enormous, you almost have to ask, why isn't he a household name? Why is Ward Bond primarily discussed in relation to John Wayne rather than to film in general? It's just strange to me that one of the most prolific character actors of the 40s and 50s remains relatively unsung today. As for his work in Hondo, well, the role fits him like a glove. Bond's chemistry with Wayne is on full display here, and the two men form a charming odd couple on screen. Just look at the sly glance they share while Greenhorn Lieutenant McKay explains the origin of an Indian fable. Without saying a word, Bond steals the entire scene with a subtle eye roll. Sadly, Bond's well-documented boozing and carousing eventually caught up with him, and he died of a massive heart attack at the age of only 57. John Wayne gave a brief eulogy at Bond's funeral extolling the unique connection that they shared when he said, "We were the closest of friends from school right on through. He was a wonderful, generous, big-hearted man." Considering how beloved he was by Western fans, it's fitting then that Bond's final film was the great Rio Bravo. Although his is a relatively small role in the film, he handles it like a true elder statesman. It's a fitting capstone to an amazing career.
You ask an excellent question. Why isn't Ward Bond more of a household name? Or if we concede that he is a household name, why don't we know more about him? Why don't we think of him as more than just, John Wayne and John Ford's drinking buddy out there on their various sailboats? It occurs to me that while we would describe Bond as a character actor, the characters he played over the course of his career actually varied quite a bit. There's no one Ward Bond persona. He could play heroes and villains. He could play people who were dressed to the nines, prim and proper. He could also play characters who were disheveled, always in a supporting role. So maybe that made it difficult to get a fix on him. It's probably also worth pointing out that Bond's politics in real life were to the right of John Wayne's, that Bond was, in fact, the type of political person that many people accused Wayne of being, that Bond was very active in the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. And I do mean very active, and also took it upon himself at various points to act as a kind of clearinghouse for actors who wanted to continue working and clear themselves of any charges of communism. There are, just bizarre stories of actors going to Bond's house and finding the front door open and calling in, and him calling from upstairs and telling them to come up, and they would come up and they'd find him sitting on the toilet where he would remain and interrogate them about their potential communist ties. So it could be some of that, as well as the difficulty of pinning him down. Maybe it was that the role that he was ultimately known for was John Wayne's friend, and that was easier to pin down. It does occur to me, though, that especially in his pairings with Wayne, he does have something of a recurring function, I suppose, that whether it's in this film or in The Searchers, he does have these important moments where he helps Wayne's characters to kind of reveal something. And in the process, we learn something about Wayne's characters that we might not know otherwise had he not been there as a kind of friendly figure to provoke him. The scene I think of in Hondo is after, Hondo returns to the camp and is, told to get some sleep in the commander's tent. Hondo goes into the tent and Buffalo is standing outside, and he asks him about a flag that he took off of some Indians, and he asks him if they were dead Indians, and Hondo replies something like, "Eventually." It's one of these really kind of subtle moments where it's Bond's character who's kind of the catalyst for an important revelation.
I wish that Bond had lived longer so that he could have been around to work with Sam Peckinpah. I feel like these were two kindred spirits in a lot of ways, both larger-than-life figures, rough guys, poetic guys in their own way, too. I feel like Peckinpah could have given him a role that maybe he didn't really have up until that point, a lead role, because he would often cast character actors in lead roles. I mean, in a way, Edmund O'Brien is sort of doing a Ward Bond in The Wild Bunch as Sykes.
Right.
He's kind of biting into that character the way Bond might have. So it's a shame that they never got to work together. Of course, everything we're mentioning here, we are leaving out Wagon Train, which is probably the closest he became to being a household name because he was in everyone's living room watching on that show. But I'm thinking here more about his cinematic career, and he just never connected in that way where there's no biography of Ward Bond out there, and you'd think by now there would be.
Yeah, and a number of people have mentioned this to me on Twitter and elsewhere and asked me about this, and really the only books that are ostensibly about Bond are about him and Wayne or him and Wayne and Ford. So there's a kind of strange dependency that developed that I can't really think of another case where one actor's career is defined by his connection to another performer who, yes, they made 23 films together, but as you said, some years Bond was making more films than that.
I also want to pay a special note here to Ward Bond's beard in Hondo. This is an epic set of facial hair. I love his beard. It fits his character so perfectly. He looks like a cross between Jason Robards in Cable Hogue and Bela Lugosi in The Island of Dr. Moreau. Like, it makes sense that his character is literally named after an animal, Buffalo Baker, because that facial hair it works for me. It's great.
Well, if there's one thing that I appreciate, it's a fine beard.
Hondo, if your friend would like to eat with us, Mr.
Buffalo? Oh, Mr. I've known you for 8 or 10 years. You must have a last name.
Well, of course I got a last name. What do you think I am?
I know what you are. There's a lady present.
Mrs. Lowe, my name is Baker. That's what it is, Buffalo Baker.
Well, you may eat with us then, Mr. Baker, and wash.
Huh?
There's a basin on the bench and a towel on the jug and soap.
Hey, you know, there's something about this place. I know what it reminds me of.
My ranch.
In California. I shot a deer right off your front porch on a butte just like that, with the creek down below and the mesas all spreading out.
It made me pack it back.
So, Andrew, what is your number 2?
My number 2 is 3D. Stereoscopic 3D was one of several innovations the film industry pursued in the 1950s, hoping to stem a decline in movie attendance that had begun after the end of the Second World War in 1946. This decline is frequently blamed on television, which is an oversimplification. Yet, the emergence of TV as an alternative form of motion picture entertainment in the early 50s did motivate the Hollywood studios to introduce advances in screen technology that were intended to differentiate cinema from television, which had a small screen and only black and white images. The studios used a variety of 3D cameras at this time, but all of them had problems. And these problems multiplied when the cameras, each and every one a heavy, unwieldy contraption that was prone to breaking, were taken out of the studios and used on location. While any type of film could theoretically be made in 3D, the desire to minimize real changes during projection dictated, as I said earlier, shorter films of around 80 minutes, which meant genre films. Westerns fit the bill, but the challenges of location shooting meant that 3D Westerns tended to stage considerably fewer gimmick shots of characters or objects lunging towards the screen than did studio-shot horror movies. Instead, the best 3D Westerns, like Taza, Son of Cochise, and especially Hondo, developed a pared-down camera style that exploited staging in depth to achieve both three-dimensional effects and thematic resonance. In Hondo, characters aren't staged beside one another in a single plane, as is customary in movies, but are instead placed in different planes of depth. Two shots routinely have one character, usually Hondo, in the foreground, and another, usually Angie, in the mid or background. The dynamic between characters isn't lateral, moving left to right, but instead forward and backward, as we advance into and recede out of the frame, an effect enhanced, one assumes, when viewed in 3D. Hondo pulls Angie outward, toward the beckoning horizon. She, in turn, pulls him inward, toward her ranch and all that it represents. This tension often plays out in long takes in scenes of the type Wayne excelled at, where the dialogue is succinct and direct, but the performances are rich in subtext. For a long time, it was believed that few moviegoers actually saw Hondo in 3D, given that the format was already on the way out, with the advent of anamorphic and other widescreen processes that didn't require uncomfortable glasses to achieve impressive visuals. We now know that the majority of Hondo's first-run screenings were, in fact, in 3D. Hondo was the second highest-earning 3D film of the decade, after the horror film House of Wax. But, sadly, unlike other 3D Westerns, like Gun Fury and Taz, Son of Cochise, Hondo has yet to be released on Blu-ray in 3D. Let's hope this happens soon so we can finally fully appreciate the film's cinematography.
Yeah, I hope they do release it so that you can tell me how it looks, because you've got the 3D home setup.
Yes.
That sounds great. I've never seen the film in 3D, obviously, but I'm still really grateful that they shot it in 3D, not because of the effect itself necessarily, but because of the amount of effort that had to be put towards making it in 3D. It almost reminds me in a way of what Jared Moshe said to us during the interview that we did with him about Ballad of Lefty Brown, when I asked him about shooting in 35 millimeter rather than digital. He said that one of the benefits was that when you're shooting on film, everyone's on their A game because they have to be. It's just too expensive to mess around like you would with digital. And I feel like the same thing might have been true here with Hondo in 3D. There was no room for error or just winging it. They really had to bring their A game in every single moment to make this work because of how difficult it was to do another take or move that camera at all. So it really had everybody rise to the occasion, I think.
That seems entirely fair to me. I mean, I also think that it forces the filmmakers to innovate. If you can't rely on camera movement to the same degree that you might have if you know you're not going to get as many takes and thus you're not going to be able to save as much in the edit, it forces you to be both efficient and creative. So that seems entirely plausible to me. As I was watching this, it occurred to me that we've actually talked about a number of 3D Westerns on the podcast so far. We talked about Taza, Son of Cochise in our Rock Hudson episode. And although we didn't talk about Gun Fury, that's another 3D Rock Hudson Western that I watched. And there are a number of others, none particularly distinguished. The Moonlighter is Fred McMurray, Barbara Stanwyck 3D Western from the 1950s. And there are some others, Wings of the Hawk, The Stranger Wore a Gun, The Nebraskan. So no real major Western apart from Hondo. But it is kind of interesting to think of these together because of the length, the short running time, and the kind of innovations that the better directors were able to bring about in order to do some really interesting things that they might not have otherwise had they not been shooting in 3D. And these are things that you can appreciate and are still effective when not viewed in 3D format.
The Duke explodes from the screen in 3D. Hondo.
These shirts are hard to come by.
The classic Western. See it all with special 3D glasses available near you.
They're here. That's what they expect. We gotta do what they don't expect.
John Wayne, Hondo. For the first time on TV in state-of-the-art 3D.
Monday at 9. Get your 3D glasses at participating Hardee's and Giant Foods.
What is your number 2, Matt?
My number 2 is John Wayne as romantic lead. Now, during our recent Saloon episode, we discussed the awkwardness that Wayne often exhibited during romantic scenes. In fact, I think you put it perfectly, Andrew, when you said that Wayne was never the suavest of performers when it came to romance. Instead, Wayne was more often a paternal figure, and the characters that he portrayed were motivated by a need to make the world safe for the women in his life, rather than to satisfy his own romantic passion for them. Although a masculine icon, he lacked the chest-thumping machismo that we associate with womanizing seducers like Robert Mitchum. Perhaps that's why so many of his most successful on-screen pairings were with mature actresses like Maureen O'Hara, Colleen Dewhurst, and Katharine Hepburn. One of the exceptions to this rule in my mind, however, is Hondo. Despite their substantial age difference, there are several scenes between John Wayne and Geraldine Page in this movie that I rank as some of the most romantic of the Duke's career. In fact, the very first moment when Hondo Lane and Angie Lowe come face to face with each other is electrically charged. There's a smoldering, Brando-esque quality to Wayne in that opening scene. Something about the way these two lonely strangers stare silently at one another, holding that look for an extra beat or two, feels fraught with unspoken desire. A short time later, while explaining that Indians can track whites by their smell, Hondo approaches Angie from behind and tells her softly that he can track her scent, too. This leads to one of my all-time favorite John Wayne speeches.
You baked today. I can smell fresh bread on you. Sometime today you cooked with salt pork. Smell that on you, too. You smell all over like soap. Took a bath, and on top of that, you smell all over like a woman. I could find you in the dark, Mrs. Lowe, and I'm only parting you.
Now, if you ask me, the phrase, "I could find you in the dark," is one of the most romantic lines of dialogue that John Wayne ever spoke. The scene is especially powerful because of the expression of longing on both of their faces. They clearly know that lines of propriety have just been crossed, but neither one of them confronts the other about it. Although Angie walks away quickly, in the very next scene she invites Hondo to spend the night in her cabin. The romantic tension between them reaches a tipping point the next morning as Hondo prepares to leave. There, while saddling his horse, he tells Angie about his late Indian wife, Destarte. When you watch the film again, pay close attention to the way that Wayne pauses, ever so briefly, before saying her name. It's a marvelous bit of acting, and the dialogue that follows is as beautiful as it is bittersweet. There are a lot of other romantic scenes scattered throughout the film, including a lovely moonlight embrace between Hondo and Angie. Then there's the moment when Hondo explains the meaning of the word Varlabena. It's an Indian term that means forever, and the way that he repeats it softly to Angie is extremely powerful. One of the things that makes Hondo so romantic is that he's honest to a fault and says exactly what's on his mind. So when he does finally tell Angie how he feels about her, we fully believe it. We trust what he says because the character is such a straight arrow. His words and thus his emotions carry extra weight. In a way, his honesty and his directness is almost sexy. Finally, I think the reason why the romance works so well here is that it's not just grafted on after the fact. It's an intrinsic part of this story. The movie takes its time to establish a genuine emotional connection between these two characters so that by the time Angie confesses her love for him, it feels well-earned rather than just coming out of nowhere, as it often seems to in westerns of this period.
I love your description of Wayne as having a kind of Brando-esque smoldering quality. You know, certainly one thing that I always find very striking about this film as a Wayne film from the 1950s is how great he looks. He just looks, fantastic. He's lean, he's muscular, and ultimately believable as a love interest. I had read a quote somewhere where Wayne himself said that he was at his mental and physical peak at 45. So that would be this film. I also completely agree with your assessment of the types of relationships that were usually successful for Wayne on screen. For everything that's wonderful about Rio Bravo, Wayne's relationship with the significantly younger Feathers, my favorite saloon girl, stretches credulity nearly to the breaking point, and it's a credit to Wayne and Angie Dickinson and the director Howard Hawks, and as well as Lee Brackett's script, that the film is able to pull that relationship off. And that is, just 5 or 6 years after this film. I mean, Wayne, as a physical presence, transforms pretty significantly over the course of the 1950s, becoming the type of older character that Wayne had aged himself to play in Red River. And that then gives way to, as I said, the kind of successful relationships that he has on screen, which is usually no relationship. That's usually a pretty safe bet for him. Or mature ones, like you mentioned, like with Maureen O'Hara in McClintock or Big Jake, or Colleen Dewhurst in McHugh. Relationships with younger women in later films. So I'm thinking of Charlene Holt in El Dorado, or Vera Miles in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance or The Hellfighters, just don't work.
I mean, a lot of credit has to go to Geraldine Page, as we've already said. She really gives him a real person to play off of, not just a type necessarily. So that elevates his performance in some profound ways. I actually end up caring about these two characters and hoping that they'll sort of get together, unlike, say, the Gunfighter, when we talked about that film, and how it's the least interesting part of that film is the relationship between Ringo and Peggy.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by feels grafted on after the fact. It's just something that he has to, like a box that has to be ticked off there. And that's what I often find in films from that period. And here it's just so not that. It's really is like a male soap opera in a lot of ways. We're invested in this guy making the right decision and deciding to change his code of ethics that he has to stand for, this loneliness that he feels. He's like a Ronin out there in the middle of nowhere. And by the end of the film, he's decided to settle down with somebody, and it doesn't seem to just come out of nowhere. The film gradually lets us know who these two people are.
Your observation about the centrality of the relationship to the film's story is really well taken. And the entire first act of the movie really is them at the ranch, getting to know one another. And it's not actually the Apache uprising that's the so-called complicating action to the story. It's actually Hondo feeling this strong pull towards the domestic life that Angie and her son represent. That's actually the drama of the movie, which is very unusual. I mean, normally the love story is secondary to the action through line of a film, but that's not the case here. I think the comparison with The Gunfighter is actually a good one, because that's a film that's supposed to be all about the kind of the wandering figure recognizing that he gave something up and trying to reclaim that his entire motivation is in fact Peggy. But our interest in the movie is all of the other social relations that develop in the town. Whereas in this case, the relationship is purely accidental and happenstance. He finds something that he actually didn't know he was looking for or needed, something he didn't think he would ever have again. And then that becomes the driving force of the story. That is very unusual in a Western. The fact that he also is able to have that life is a stark contrast to many other Westerns, Shane in particular, given the release date.
Right, where it's denied to him at the end. Yeah,
exactly. Mm-hmm. That there is another horizon. There's a ranch in California.
This Indian wife you have.
Had. She's dead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring up an unhappy memory.
I can't remember anything I'm happy about. Just Stardy.
Stardy. How musical. What does it mean?
You can't say it except in Mescalero. It means morning. But that isn't what it means either. It means more than just that. Indian words mean the sound and feel of a word, like crack of dawn, first bronze light that makes the butte stand out against the gray desert. The first sound you hear of a brook curling over some rocks with trout jumping. It's like when you get up in the first light, just you and her, and you go out of a wickiup where it smells kind of smoky and private, just you and her, and kind of safe with just the two of you. Stand outside and feel the bite of the first wind coming down from the high divide. Promises snowfall. Yeah. Can't say it in English, but that was her name. Just started.
Okay, Andrew, and what is your number one choice for Hondo?
My number one is Hondo as the opposite of The Searchers. As you know, Matt, my favorite Western and one of my two favorite films is The Searchers. The Searchers is also widely regarded as the greatest Western. We both know, though, that just because a film is considered great or artistically or culturally significant does not mean it is popular. In his excellent book, The Searchers, The Making of an American Legend, Glenn Frankel suggestively calls The Searchers, quote, perhaps the greatest Hollywood film that few people have seen, gaining in stature even as it lingers in a space between legend and obscurity. In a commentary that accompanied the 2012 Sight and Sound poll results of greatest films, in which The Searchers was named the 7th greatest film ever made, the film scholar Ian Christie described The Searchers as a Western for people who don't like Westerns, meaning film critics, as a way of explaining its strong showing. A backhanded compliment if there ever was, but one that echoes claims of other critics that The Searchers is, in a sense, a Western for snobs, rather than true fans of the genre. Now, I will defend The Searchers till the day I die, sure as the turning of the earth, but I do find it plausible that the movie is not widely seen, or is seen mostly by film critics and scholars. Loyal fans of Western films and of John Wayne, of course, persist, but these groups, who we might assume to be most likely to embrace The Searchers, strike me as relatively uninterested in the movie, preferring TV shows like Gunsmoke, somewhat more recent miniseries and films like Lonesome Dove and Tombstone, or other Wayne Westerns like True Grit, McClintock, and Hondo. Now, Hondo, in fact, makes for a suggestive contrast with The Searchers. As the movie's entry in the invaluable British Film Institute Companion to the Western observes, Hondo can be viewed as a counterpoint to The Searchers. Both films are, as I said earlier, man who knows Indians Westerns. But while The Searchers undermines the heroism of that character by exposing his grim fanaticism, Hondo concentrates on a humanizing process that sees the embittered Indian fighter softened and ultimately redeemed by love and the promise of domestic life. Ethan Edwards is almost a dark mirror image of Hondo. Now, that it is the dark side of the mirror that so appeals to critics and scholars is maybe to be expected. But I don't know how I feel about that. This also seems to point to one of the recurring features, or I guess motifs, we might say, in my own writing about the Western. And that's a concern with the disparity between the Westerns people like me write about and the Westerns fans of the genre actually watch. It seems to me that Hondo is really The Searchers, but The Searchers that fans of the Western and the Duke are more keen to see.
I think you're dead on right there. That's the appeal of the film. It's shocking to me that more people haven't seen The Searchers. It still blows me away that people haven't sat down necessarily and watched it. I don't know what's keeping them from doing that. But when it comes to Ethan Edwards and Hondo Lane, it's hard to imagine two John Wayne characters who would have hated each other more than these two men. The second that Ethan started blasting away at a bunch of bison just to make sure that his enemies don't eat them, I think Hondo would have knocked him cold right there. It just doesn't make sense in his clear-eyed philosophy of how one is supposed to live their life. So there are a lot of parallels to these films, and I think you're right. They are mirrors of each other. It's also interesting to me how often The Searchers gets brought up in various conversations about its reach or about films it influenced. And Hondo just doesn't. At least I don't hear it often brought up, certainly not as much as The Searchers is.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think Hondo is a really interesting case. A lot of it, again, has to do with the unavailability of the film for so long that it was a film that, and I know we'll talk more about this in a second, you were lucky to see on television once, every few years, maybe once a decade. I think the fact that it was directed by John Farrow and not by John Ford or Howard Hawks meant that people who are, film critics or film scholars were just less inclined to look at it because it didn't have a famous director. And then I think there's also the kind of John Wayne stigma that, not only was this one of his films that wasn't directed by one of these guys who could get him to transcend his own persona, but it was in fact his production. This was the type of film that Wayne wanted to make and he had the power to make. And there's an argument to be made that maybe with the exception of The Alamo, this was the film that Wayne was possibly the most hands-on in the production of, especially as a producer. His son Michael eventually took over a lot of the producing duties for Batjack Films, but at this point, Wayne was in charge of almost every aspect of the film. So there's a number of reasons that make Hondo, I guess a film that many people just weren't able to see and then probably weren't inclined to see. But it's certainly among, again, fans of the genre and certainly fans of Wayne, has a tremendous reputation. I mean, it is a fan favorite in the way that those other films are, all of which don't have the benefit of a Hawks or a Ford in the director's chair.
The only time recently that I've seen Hondo mentioned is a couple of nights ago. I watched that 1991 this weird pseudo-Western, Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man. Yeah. I had totally forgotten that early in the film, Don Johnson and Mickey Rourke walk into a bar. And the first thing that they see when they walk into this dive bar is a poster on the wall of Hondo. And standing right next to the poster is this beautiful bronze sculpture of Wayne as Hondo with Sam the dog sculpted right next to him. It's great. And the film pauses for a moment, so we see those images, and then Don Johnson salutes Hondo.
Yeah. Well, that image of Wayne as Hondo in the buckskin with Sam beside him walking out of the desert is maybe the most iconic image of Wayne. But it's that image seems to have taken on almost a life of its own, or a certain power that's divorced from the particulars of the film itself, the story it tells.
Right.
There's this kind of interesting thing that happens where Hondo kind of has a reputation. I think even just the name it's just interesting to say, Hondo, right? It's unusual, but it's also evocative of the West. And then that image, I think for many people kind of symbolizes less the film itself and tells us something, I guess, about John Wayne at his, as I said before, kind of at his peak in some ways.
You're right. That pose is so iconic. It's almost like the classic pose of Marilyn Monroe on the street where her dress is blowing up. And we don't necessarily associate that with the film it's from, but we associate that with part of this character that she embodied, this fun-loving sort of sprightly figure, sort of like James Dean. There's that beautiful picture of him from Rebel where he's leaning against the wall with the cigarette. Right. We don't necessarily think of that as an image from Rebel Without a Cause. It's his persona. And I think that image of Wayne walking out of the desert with the dog beside him, yeah, I think that has taken on a life of its own.
Yeah.
Hondo! 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 Out of the parched wasteland where 1,000 men had ridden, one man was walking out. Hondo, hot-blooded with the fury of the plains that bred him, silent as gun smoke, a stranger to all but the surly dog at his side. And the woman watched him come toward her, closer and closer, knowing that whatever happened, this man and the gun he carried were written into her destiny. Like the name etched into the gun, the brand of the gunfighter was burned into his life, marking tomorrow with a challenge that hid behind every crag, in every canyon, while each yesterday stalked him across danger-ridden trails with a savage vengeance that followed him even to the top of the world. Here was the test of strength, where a hand that held a knife held the fate of a frontier. The treacherous ambush by the renegade whose life he had saved. The strange secret that sealed lips he longed to press to those of the woman he loved. The terrible shadow that stood between him and the boy who dreamed of being a man like Hondo.
All right, Matt, I'm done for this episode. What is your number one?
My number one is the TV show Married with Children. Now, you might be wondering what a sitcom filled with raunchy sex jokes has to do with one of John Wayne's most beloved westerns. Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. 2 of the show's nearly 260 episodes were built entirely around the premise of watching a rare screening of Hondo on television. The first time that Hondo made an appearance on Married with Children was in the 2nd season, in an episode titled All in the Family. In that episode, the show's main character, Al Bundy, finds his plan to watch Hondo thwarted when his wife's eccentric family makes an impromptu visit and creates havoc right before the film is about to be shown. Curiously enough, this episode also includes a reference to the 1953 Western Shane, which apparently is another of Al Bundy's favorite movies. I actually remember seeing this episode when it first aired on Fox in 1988 and thinking to myself, I'm 20 years old and I have the same exact taste in film as an angry middle-aged shoe salesman. Kind of makes you think. Anyway, the next time that Hondo appeared as a major plot point on the series was in the 8th season in an episode titled Assault and Batteries. Now, this was a very special episode because it was broadcast in 3D. It was part of a network event called Foxorama that was designed to attract attention during the all-important sweeps month. Viewers were encouraged to purchase special 3D glasses at participating 7-Eleven stores around the country and then tune in to watch the 3D fun. In this episode, our hapless hero once again tries to catch a rare screening of Hondo on TV, but his wife, Peg, forces him to fix a broken step in the basement, and naturally, trouble ensues. The episode also includes a black-and-white dream sequence set in the Old West, where Al Bundy, doing his best John Wayne impression, imagines that he's a cowboy named, you guessed it, Bundo. The truth is, it makes perfect sense that a character like Al Bundy would worship at the altar of John Wayne. Al's a man who feels beaten down by life, and he longs for the escapist entertainment of his youth. He's also somewhat conservative politically, often espousing his fondness for President Eisenhower. That is, when he's not busy insulting his progressive neighbor Marcy. I sense a real kinship between Al and his cinematic idol, so the inclusion of Hondo as a reoccurring plot point is quite revealing. Honestly, I was a huge Married with Children fan, and I watched it endlessly in college, so when we began discussing a podcast episode centered on Hondo, these two sitcom episodes instantly sprang to mind. They're both available to watch online if you do some digging, so when you're done listening to this podcast, why not look them up for yourself and have a good laugh or two?
Your lives are worthless compared to Hondo. I don't know if truer words have ever been spoken on television. It was good fun to watch these two episodes. I hadn't seen the first one. I had seen the second one. It occurred to me as I was watching it. But what was interesting is I actually didn't remember the Hondo parts of it. I did remember the parts of Al being trapped in the supermarket and not being able to get out for whatever reason. The Hondo part didn't stick with me. Obviously, as we said today, it is his historical fact that the rare television showing was, until the 1990s, really the only chance anyone would have to see the movie. So this, for the John Wayne fan, would have been true to life. But I have to observe that neither episode refers to anything specific about Hondo beyond its title and that it stars John Wayne and that it's a great movie. And this is especially apparent in that second episode's Western fantasy sequence, which does have Al doing his best John Wayne, but is nothing like Hondo whatsoever. So maybe this is just more evidence of the point we made a few minutes ago, that Hondo, the idea, the title as a John Wayne film, has kind of taken on a life of its own, so that people feel really comfortable invoking it without maybe even having actually seen the movie. I have to wonder if Al has ever actually seen Hondo himself.
It's great. I mean, I think you're right. The title Hondo was the perfect choice for this gag, whether it means anything or not. Hearing him yell for Hondo as he throws a cash register at a wall, I lose it every time. So it was a great choice to do that. And it has to be said how amazing Ed O'Neill is as Al Bundy. I mean, few actors are born to play their character the way he was. So, I mean, you can watch these episodes just for that. You don't have to care about the Hondo aspect, although it really does help.
Well, honey, now you can fix the basement step. Peg, Hondo's coming on at 3:30. Hondo, Peg! John Wayne's best movie. It only comes on once every 17 years. Oh, Peg, please let me watch Hondo.
Oh, now, Al, it's only 9:30. You can fix the step and watch your stupid Hondo.
Well, that about wraps things up for our Hondo episode. Until next time, I'm Matthew Chernov.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson. And you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.